The city streets lay quiet, their usual clamor muffled by the weight of the late hour. A thin mist hung in the air, softening the harsh glow of the streetlights. Outside a shuttered diner, Marcus sat hunched on the cold pavement. His shoulders, cloaked in a frayed army green blanket, slumped under the weight of exhaustion. The cardboard sign beside him read, "Hungry. Please help." His fingers, stiff and raw from the biting wind, gripped an empty coffee cup. Occasionally, a passerby would glance his way, their gaze flickering with fleeting discomfort before hurrying past. Marcus sighed deeply, his breath forming clouds that dissolved into the frigid night. Once, he had been a skilled mechanic with steady hands and a life full of potential. But fate had dealt him a series of harsh blows, an economic downturn, a factory closure, a series of misfortunes that stripped him of his stability. Now, he lived day by day, his world reduced to a few scattered belongings and the generosity of strangers. The quiet was broken by the sharp crunch of boots against the pavement. Marcus tensed. From his position on the ground, the figure approaching seemed impossibly large. As the man stepped into the light, the gleam of a police badge caught Marcus's eye. Officer Daniels was a man of solid build, his uniform pressed and pristine, the radio on his shoulder crackling faintly. His eyes, sharp and unkind, scanned the street before settling on Marcus. Daniels had been patrolling this beat for over a decade. To him, the sight of homelessness on the city's corners wasn't just a nuisance, it was an affront to his sense of order. Tonight, his mood was particularly sour, fueled by a long shift and an unshakable bitterness he carried like a second skin. "Hey," Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the stillness. "What do you think you're doing here?" Marcus looked up, startled, and quickly tried to gather his thoughts. "I'm just sitting here, officer. I'm not bothering anyone." His voice was calm, but carried the weariness of someone accustomed to justifying his existence. Daniels stepped closer, his shadow falling over Marcus. "You're loitering. This isn't a shelter. You can't just set up camp wherever you please." "I'm not camping," Marcus replied, his tone steady but measured. "I'll move along soon. I'm just resting." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Marcus's belongings, a battered backpack and the sign, and felt his irritation deepen. He'd heard the stories before. Hard luck, bad breaks, society's failings. To him, they were excuses, a way to sidestep responsibility. "You people always have a reason, don't you?" Daniel sneered, crossing his arms. "You think the world owes you something?" Marcus met his gaze, his own dark eyes filled with a quiet defiance. "No one owes me anything," he said softly. "I just need a little time to get back on my feet." Daniel scoffed, his disdain evident. "On your feet? You've got one foot in the gutter and the other halfway there." He took a step closer, towering over Marcus. "I'm not running a charity here. Get your things and move. Now." Unseen by either man, Emma stood several yards away, her figure obscured by the shadow of a narrow alley. She had stepped outside to take a phone call but had paused when she noticed the unfolding interaction. Emma was in her mid-20s, her sharp instincts honed by years of working as a freelance writer. Something about the scene struck her as wrong. The officer's posture was aggressive, his voice laced with something more than authority. Instinctively, Emma reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a swipe of her thumb, she began recording, her pulse quickening. Daniels crouched slightly, bringing his face closer to Marcus. "Do you know what happens when people like you hang around? You scare off business. Make this city look bad. I'm cleaning up these streets, and you're part of the mess." Marcus remained seated, his hands gripping his blanket tightly. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, officer," he said, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. But Daniels wasn't listening. His frustration boiled over, and he gestured sharply at Marcus's belongings. Get up.
Now.
Or I'll make you. Emma's grip on her phone tightened. Her heart pounded in her chest as she silently willed Marcus to comply. She wanted to intervene, to say something, but fear held her back. What if Daniels turned his ire on her? Marcus slowly began to gather his things, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He didn't want to provoke Daniels further, but his pride wouldn't let him rush either. Daniels watched him with a scowl, tapping his boot against the pavement in a show of impatience. The tension in the air was thick, the night's stillness now heavy with unspoken threats. Emma continued to film, her breath shallow as she waited to see what would happen next. Daniels straightened, his gaze sweeping the street to ensure they were alone. Satisfied that no one was watching, or so he thought, he took a step back. "You've got 2 minutes," he said coldly, his voice echoing in the quiet. "And if I see you here again, you'll regret it." Marcus didn't respond. He focused on packing his few belongings, his movements a quiet act of defiance. Emma's phone captured it all. The words, the tension, the power imbalance. She didn't know what she'd do with the footage yet, but she knew one thing. The world needed to see what had happened here tonight. The section ends with Emma lowering her phone, her resolve hardening. Daniels, oblivious to the silent witness, turned and strode back toward his patrol car. Marcus, still crouched on the pavement, let out a slow, measured breath. The night, heavy with unspoken tension, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The air grew colder, wrapping the street in a brittle stillness. Marcus moved deliberately, gathering his meager belongings into his tattered backpack. The sound of his slow movements seemed unnaturally loud against the oppressive quiet. Officer Daniels loomed nearby, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on Marcus like a predator assessing its prey. "You're taking too long," Daniels snapped, his voice sharp and echoing in the empty street. "I said move it." Marcus paused, his back stiffening under the officer's glare. "I'm going as fast as I can, officer," he said, his tone low but steady. He wasn't defiant, but there was a quiet dignity in his voice that seemed to needle Daniels. "Fast isn't good enough," Daniels growled, taking a step forward. The toe of his polished boot tapped the edge of Marcus's backpack. "Do you need me to help you move along?" From her vantage point in the alley, Emma felt her stomach knot. Her phone was still recording, the small screen capturing every moment of the escalating tension. Her instincts screamed at her to intervene, but fear kept her rooted in place. Marcus turned his head slightly, glancing up at Daniels. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said carefully. His voice carried a mix of weariness and restraint, as though he were measuring each word to avoid tipping the officer's fragile temper. "Trouble's exactly what you're causing," Daniel shot back. His voice rose, the frustration in his tone betraying his growing impatience. "You people think you can just sit around, dragging this city down. Not on my watch." The words stung, but Marcus forced himself to remain calm. He turned back to his bag, his fingers trembling as he struggled to zip it shut. The zipper caught, stuck on the worn fabric, and Marcus's heart sank. Daniel's frustration boiled over. "I said move," he barked, lifting his boot and shoving Marcus's bag aside with a harsh kick. The force of the motion sent the bag skidding across the pavement, spilling its contents: an old jacket, a pair of mismatched socks, and a dog-eared photo of a smiling young boy. "Hey!" Marcus cried, scrambling after his belongings. His voice cracked with both anger and despair as he knelt to gather the scattered items. But Daniels wasn't finished. "You want to sit here like a bum?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Fine, stay in the gutter where you belong." Without warning, he lashed out, kicking Marcus square in the side. Marcus grunted in pain, clutching his ribs as he fell to the ground. His blanket slipped from his shoulders, revealing the thin, weathered frame beneath. He looked up at Daniels, his face a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. Emma's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she continued to record, her phone now shaking slightly in her grip. The scene before her was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't look away. This wasn't just cruelty, it was power wielded without conscience. Daniels straightened, the anger in his eyes briefly flickering into something closer to smug satisfaction. "Let that be a lesson," he muttered, adjusting his belt as he turned away. But Marcus wasn't done. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his knees. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as he gathered his spilled belongings, one item at a time. The photo of the boy lay face down on the pavement, its edges damp from the night's dew. Marcus reached for it with trembling fingers, cradling it like a fragile relic. "You're wrong about me," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't look up at Daniels, but his words carried the weight of years spent fighting to hold onto his dignity. "I'm not what you think I am." Daniels paused mid-step, turning back with a scowl. "What did you say?" Marcus rose unsteadily to his feet, clutching his bag against his chest. His dark eyes met Daniels with a quiet strength that belied the pain coursing through his body. "You don't know me," he said simply. For a moment, Daniels seemed caught off guard, his expression flickering with uncertainty. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a sneer. "Get out of my sight," he barked, his tone harsher than before. Emma, still hidden in the shadows, lowered her phone slightly. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched Marcus limp away, his figure growing smaller with each step. Daniels stood motionless for a moment before heading back to his patrol car, the radio on his shoulder crackling faintly. Emma remained where she was, her mind racing. The video on her phone was undeniable proof of what had just transpired, a stark, raw testament to the abuse of power she had witnessed. But what could she do with it? Confronting Daniels directly was out of the question. The man's hostility was palpable, and she had no illusions about her ability to reason with him. Instead, she made a silent vow. This moment wouldn't end here, in the cold and dark of an empty street. Marcus's pain, Daniel's actions, they deserve to be seen, to be heard. The section closes as Emma steps back into the shadows, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Above, the streetlights flickered, their pale glow casting long, fractured shadows on the pavement. The air was heavy with a sense of inevitability, the promise of reckoning hanging in the balance. The city awoke to a storm it hadn't anticipated. By morning, Emma's video had spread across social media like wildfire. Its rawness, the unmistakable cruelty captured in every frame, left viewers enraged and demanding answers. The video's title, stark and simple, "Racist Cop Abuses Homeless Man," struck a nerve, galvanizing communities both near and far. Emma hadn't slept. After hours of hesitation and deliberation, she had uploaded the footage, her post accompanied by a heartfelt plea. "This isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. We can't look away anymore." The response was overwhelming. Messages flooded her inbox, some offering support, others expressing disbelief or anger. Among the viewers was Lila Carter, a tenacious local journalist known for exposing corruption in the city. Lila reached out to Emma immediately, her voice steady and serious as she spoke over the phone. "This is important," Lila said, "but it can't just be a viral moment. If you're willing, I want to tell the whole story." Emma agreed, her resolve hardening. She had been a passive observer long enough. It was time to act. Marcus, meanwhile, sat in a modest shelter on the city's edge, nursing bruised ribs and a heavy heart. He hadn't seen the video. He didn't own a phone, and his days were consumed by survival, not scrolling through the news. But he noticed the difference almost immediately. People approached him with kindness he wasn't accustomed to. A volunteer at the shelter handed him a fresh set of clothes and a warm meal without hesitation. A social worker stopped by his cot and asked if he needed help finding a place to stay or getting medical care. "Why all this attention now?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice tinged with confusion. The social worker hesitated. "People saw what happened to you last night," she said gently. They're angry and they want to help. Marcus didn't understand at first. What had changed? He had spent years enduring the city's indifference, its blind eyes turned to his suffering. What had made this time different? Officer Daniels was less fortunate. By midday, the video had reached his precinct, and the fallout was swift. The department released a statement, curt and calculated. The officer involved in the incident has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The words meant little to the protesters gathering outside the station, their signs and chants echoing down the streets. "Justice for Marcus," they shouted. "No more abuse." Inside the station, Daniels seethed. His superiors treated him like a liability, their stern looks making it clear he was on his own. He didn't understand why this was happening. To him, he had been doing his job, maintaining order, enforcing the law. But the world saw something else, and for the first time, Daniels felt the weight of accountability. Emma met Marcus later that day, accompanied by Lila. They found him sitting outside the shelter, his gaze distant and weary. Emma approached cautiously, unsure how he would react. "Marcus," she said softly, holding out a hand in greeting. He looked up, surprised. "Do I know you?" "I was there," Emma explained, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw what happened. I recorded it." Marcus's expression shifted, a mix of confusion and apprehension. "You filmed it?" Emma nodded. "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted. "I wanted people to see what happened to you. I wanted them to care." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he exhaled deeply, nodding slowly. "People care now?" he asked, his tone skeptical but not unkind. "They do," Lila interjected. "And they want to help. But we need your voice, Marcus. Your story can make a difference." Marcus hesitated. He had spent years being ignored, overlooked, dismissed. The idea that his voice could matter felt foreign. But something in Emma's eyes, her earnestness, her guilt, convinced him to try. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's talk." The interview aired that evening, a raw, unfiltered account of Marcus's life and the events of the previous night. Lila didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths, the systemic failures that had left Marcus homeless, the unchecked power that Daniels had wielded against him, and the city's broader complicity in allowing such injustices to persist. Emma's video played alongside Marcus's words, the images of Daniels' aggression contrasting sharply with Marcus's quiet dignity. The story resonated deeply, sparking discussions on local news channels and social media platforms. By the next morning, the city's mayor held a press conference. Flanked by the police chief and several community leaders, she addressed the growing unrest. "We have seen the footage," the mayor said solemnly. "What happened to Marcus was unacceptable. We are committed to ensuring that justice is served and that steps are taken to prevent incidents like this in the future." Behind the scenes, Daniels faced mounting pressure. Public outrage had reached a fever pitch, and his union's support wavered. When the internal investigation concluded, Daniels was officially dismissed, and criminal charges were filed against him for misconduct and assault. For Marcus, the weeks that followed were transformative. Donations poured in from people across the country, providing him with enough to secure stable housing and access to medical care. More importantly, he found himself surrounded by a community that genuinely cared, volunteers, activists, and even strangers who stopped him on the street to offer words of support. Emma stayed in touch, visiting him regularly. At first, Marcus wasn't sure what to make of her, but over time, he came to see her as more than a bystander. She had been the catalyst, the spark that turned his private pain into a public reckoning. On a crisp, clear evening weeks later, Marcus stood before a crowd at a local community center. The room was packed with people who had come to hear him speak. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the podium, but his voice was steady as he began. "I didn't ask for what happened to me to become a story," he said. "But it did. And now we have a chance to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." The room erupted into applause. Emma, standing near the back, wiped a tear from her cheek.